The God Excuse: The Case Against Christian Nationalism in America by Matthew Larimore. Introduction. Guilty until proven innocent. Perhaps the targeted believers, who I will identify majorly throughout this work as the loyalist, will humor me in my predetermined position of authority over the contents within it. And perhaps maybe even further, I can generate a consideration of their own disposition. Perhaps I will not capture such an intended audience at all. Or perhaps, if I may be allowed one more possible scenario, I shall eat my own words before it is all done. If I am to greet you once more into the following chapter, and the chapter that precedes that one, and so on, then my main objective has been satisfied to my most capable doing, simply being heard. If I am fortunate enough, maybe a few will concur with the context and resign from their theocratic oppressionist state. A few just might oblige, if only a few. Though at face value, and practically subtextual value, given the subheadline in this book, that it appears as a mere exclusive assault to Christianity, that is purely a matter of circumstance when concerning the United States. You hardly ever discover a daily chronicle of Muslim urgency or Judas political discourse. The opposite can be said of Christianity in both categories. And these people often attempt to assign their excuses behind these competitor ideologies when they aren't assigning them elsewhere in the minority community. Who are the loyalists within this sect, you may ask? Specifically, they are the spectators within their circles who enable and allow this to happen, despite their proclaimed personal indifference. Some of them may not even actually possess such an indifference, in fact, but delude themselves into believing so in addition to protecting their faith's indefensible necessity. There is always an alternative to religion, the opposite of faith. The loyalists, however, are incapable of giving such a concept a divine purpose within their lives, in contrast to the oppression their indifferences within it perpetuates. Thus, the original God excuse was the birthing of several thousand variations of just the Christian sect alone. Odds are favorable that if you are a believer, a loyalist believer at that you will have a few educated guesses on the topics I'm going to cover in the pages that follow. I think you ought to take this moment, then, to look in the mirror and ask yourself what your excuse is then in maintaining the status quo in that faith's favor. Whatever may be the case, you should also come to the reality that we probably share a common objective. As a member of the fastest growing minority club, the non-believers, I am more than aware of the inside assistance we need. It is the sole prerequisite behind the very existence of this book, which I had originally started to pen over a decade before its publishing. I am an equal opportunity religion basher, except in regard to the unconstitutional intimidation of the American secular principle. The fascist insurgence upon this principle has been entirely Christian imposed, and it is the very same that proclaim this to be a nation of the Christian God. No other religious sect declares America their exclusive ideological home front, or as the central proponent to the means of legislation. No other religious sect has multiple state flags either bearing their faith's exclusive symbol or their federal courts displaying their exclusive faith's list of 10 commandments. So yes, indeed, Christianity more than deserves to be singled out over the God excuse in the United States. I've long heard the exhausted excuse that Christians don't impose out of hostility, but rather because the number of non-Christians who will be affected by their prejudice and invasive practices are too minimal to notice. That sounds about right for people who proclaim to spend most of their time in church walls, on their knees, with their eyes closed, and their ears to muffled incoherence. The existence of this book alone dismisses this exhausted claim, and there are many that proceeded from far more impressive thinkers and writers. Do not mistake this as a book written in the name of atheism, or even in the name of agnosticism. This is an anti-theist book written in the name of secularism. What separates these will, I hope, be laid out at length. It is a tired saying within the theocratic community that atheism is as much of a religion as Christianity. So then, why do these First Amendment admirers want to violate that religion's freedom of practice? Why are we constantly dismissed from public assemblies and invocations entirely by Christian members of the state? It is often out of supremacist dogma, the complexity of prejudicial jurisdiction, that such an oppression is not only demonstrated openly by figures of authority, but demonstrated by figures of authority without protest from their loyalist constituents who claim to be in favor of an equal union. Given this overwhelming tendency, the claim of a Christian reformation brings forth an unending skepticism within the skeptic community whom they continue to weed out. How many members of the state can a believer say that has walked out on them during their testimony and invocation? How many believers can say that their state denies them the right to run for office by local constitutional grounds? And how many believers can say that the state has generated political discourse against them in an act of appealing to a specific electoral demographic? If you're a loyalist, you will tend to only raise your hand at the last question for its obvious lack of context. You rise to proclaim that the existence of homosexuals and the access of a woman's ownership over her own body is the discourse in which your faith is ever diminished. Need I remind you that these things all predate your faith, and that the presumption of truth within the articles of your faith's body of work had long been declared by prior Egyptian sects from which your faith has plagiarized many of its contents? Need I remind you that the human condition is not dependent on faith or religion, but that faith and religion both are entirely dependent on the human condition? How many members are in the army of God, sustaining a war of existences with their fellow humans in the name of political discourse through the God excuse? How many members of their opposition have bragged about a similar membership of their own accord? I think you know the answers to all of these. The central point being that if the loyalists are not applauding violence elsewhere, they are attempting to simulate their own and assign all accountability of their actions to their victims. If this is the best these people and their churches who welcome them with open arms can do to benefit the secular union, then for what it's worth, I am not impressed. The onus is on religion, on the loyalists and the apologists, to justify their injections and their unearned perseverance. This spectacle of stupidity and disestablished intellect raves on today in an ever more disintegrating form of segregation and discriminatory fashion, both externally and internally. It is here that this book intends to insert itself and force its hand in the name of reason, for the apologists are a long-lost cause, and the loyalists have become but a gigantic reset setting of the same nonsensical principles that have brought us to the brink of extinction both as a society as well as a species. Man has far exceeded any precise measurement of intellect than his greedy immature gods had originally granted him at birth. Education was not something created by the Almighty in any of the 6 days it took to create the planet. The same circumstance stands with money, or shall I specify, good fortune, green enrichment, or wealth, at the expense of the poor's own earning. And not to make my words rhyme here, yearning. The United States citizen owes taxes to its own government on such a yearly basis for an income even less than $10,000. A church-going politician, and an heir to General Electric, with all their millions and billions, on the grounds of faith-based mockery, pay none. The true American dream, where only the Christian population thrive on the orchestrated failures of others. Of course, I was taught as a little boy that belief in God granted you the skeleton key to heaven. Never was I told that it also granted you the power to control your surroundings against everyone's will. And as I was taught about the skeleton key, I was kept locked inside of a building away from society where nobody else heard it, and therefore probably lacked any knowledge about such an advantage. It doesn't help much either when somehow God is always in agreement with each personality enwrapped within these walls, and in complete protest of all else outside of them, according to the occupants. When vacant, it is just as vulnerable to graffiti as a train car, In Washington, Missouri, the closest to graffiti you'll get on a church is a chalk outline on the front lobby porch of a hopscotch chart, which is the most exercise an average American parent gives their child other than ripping open the plastic bag containing a McDonald's toy. Intellect is everything, while theism is nothing but a purified insult to intellect. The outright evidence that clarifies such a claim comes directly out of the many forms that write one specific deity's laws among their own desired imagery, while at the same time properly keeping up with the restrained discovery of old news. The women's rights movement has all this time all but succeeded with the existence of the Bible still intact, still teaching to our modern-day children that women shall obey their commanding husbands or face decapitation, remain silent in church unless their husband waves a hand of permissible authority, bear children before the husband dies, otherwise engage in intercourse with the husband's brother to fulfill their reproductive duties, conceal their facial features, for a woman's face is an abomination of the Lord. All of the things Christians accuse the Quran of bestowing upon an ever-changing world, they are just as guilty of and accustomed to. I am personally a fan of the story of Vashti, a queen from the Book of Esther, because of her independent actions against her husband's emasculation when she refused to obey his order to disrobe for him and his party. Of course, the older and more sensitive congregation will tell you that she only refused to dance, but they'll refuse to say why their own book they claim God wrote contains differentiating tellings of the same story. But for me, it is pleasant to see rebellion in the form of autonomous sustainment, no matter what the cost, in a book where most, if not all, women outside of her story were punished for far less resistance. It almost relates to my own history, threatening my life with fire enough times without merit, and I will only consume more bacon. But indeed, real or artificial, which regardless of my appeal to its morality, I'd go with the latter, her sacrifice to herself bloomed into an extreme cause for women abroad, and it is indeed a sacrifice far more luxurious and powerful than that of Jesus Christ, who cannot even hold a sack in comparison due to his foretold knowledge of his own resurrection. Vashti is truly the only story and character from a book that has purloined so many of its rituals and fairy tales from separate religious scriptures such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead that I hold dear to my figure. That is not to say that atheists are mildly limited to what reading they find charitable. It was Emily Dickinson who described faith as a fine invention. What a more appropriate description to something that only benefits the sole believer as long as they are willing to convince themselves in any way that everyone else is inadequate to their person. An invention that takes the form of many from the individual wants of hungry men and women for superiority and an afterworld of slumber parties among themselves. Faith is nothing more than 1,000 ideas, and people only choose one to be good. It may be fun to pretend to do the impossible, but even children grow out of playing hide and seek. The notorious face of the Roman Catholic Church, with its ever-growing tradition of tall hats and bright dresses, had the most relentless nerve to proclaim Marxism as a lifestyle that no longer conforms to our current society. A statement indeed that procures such finance from heresy, which they supposedly frown upon, in the very likeness of context to Orthodox Judaism and Christianity. I summon such as old a word from the Inquisition era such as heresy, because how else shall one attempt to market a thought on the Catholic Church's approval to refuse child sex abuse victims within their very walls justice from my very own government? Religion is man-made, the outnumbering castes of them proves them to be, and mankind's own utility, dreary from such dull communion, an old ritual of cannibalistic simulation of their very deity on a monthly basis, that through communion henceforth had only served my disgust for the Baptist Christianity I had been born into without option, a ritual of pure human stupefaction. I did not grow to become more appreciative of what sacrifices Jesus pretended to design for the world through this awful ritual. I only aroused an interest in the act of cannibalism as a whole, and by my 18th birthday, I had learned enough about the major religions and cannibalism to see not a shred of difference, but just a crack in the mirror. I grew to hate even more that the church was disguising innocent food items many around the world beyond our coordinates were not fortunate enough to nourish their dissolving bodies with as human blood and flesh. And I couldn't help but wonder if any stooped to cannibalism in every literal sense to overcome the obstacle of an enforced unnatural death of starvation. If no one else took this to account beside me, was I really the worst person in the entire congregation of pretentious fearmongers? I refused any emotion both local and distant to convince me I was. Here lies the God excuse to lay acceptance to an act of cannibalism, the victim being the human saboteur of their respective deity. Not only was Jesus not actually consumed upon his death, but had he been, how would such a resurrection have taken place, and to a point of not destroying the appetites of those involved? Jesus would have been defecated and urinated outward. A story such as this would have made better do at an Easter Sunday service, one I am certain I and other atheists would enjoy far too much. I make it no secret that I am, as well as most other atheists around the world, overly aggressive, shall I say my cup runneth over, in my arguments against the disgust and poison this world is force-fed from the boneless hands of religion. I am proud to be, in order for our voices to be heard through undeafened ears. If it is in any form the objective of the reader of this work, painted by experience and historical fact, to raise the holy walls upon my soul in the order of entrapment, that ironically religions claim their gods had planned out for me to be this way, allow me to lessen the travel of their fruitless initiatives by leveling out the field of these arguments, professing that I, as a being of my very mother's womb and my father's punchy sperms, hold no bias environment in such discussions where only the feedback of knowledge holds merit regardless of whatever is factual or fictitious. I believe wholeheartedly in equality of all, and only fight for the freedom of those who remain locked within themselves because of religious brats. When you have bishops of the Catholic Church being backed by their very Pope to ground as much child victims in sexual activity, as long as it can remain underground, with much appreciation to the American democracy for dismissing it from investigation, so that instead people such as Alexander On can be beat nearly to his last breath and be sent to prison for a term of 3 years for committing the crime of being an atheist, aggressiveness is the only route to the ears of closed-minded crucifix bearers, and indeed it shall become sensitive for some, others I hope to be useful. It will become aggressive, and it furthermore will outstretch honor among, in this particular case, the author and the reader, but I can suppose that is better than a slit throat for being a woman without her veil in the Islam jurisdiction, or an emotionally tormented griever of a dead soldier from an anti-gay Christian picketer. The amount of lives religion has destroyed far exceeds the proposed amount of lives it claims to have saved. As the upheaval of mental health awareness becomes more endorsed and observed, this shall unveil the trauma inflicted upon millions from the cult of death. And you have sensed the revolution is beyond reformation, it is through renouncement. The negligence of your faith's security in the name of secrecy of your moral betrayals and your undoings of societal equality is ever more apparent. The saying, "it's never too late," is indeed a well-reasoned observation to take at this point. Before the excuses that project within this book commence, I ask you, what is your excuse?